So thank you everybody for joining and so plentiful as well. My name is Diane Nolan. I'm a Managing Director at Accenture in Capital Markets, and I'm your facilitator for today's session. I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel who've got a lot of experience in artificial intelligence in their day-to-day job, and hopefully we'll have a very pragmatic discussion today. So maybe, Matt, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Davey. I work for SocGen, heading a product management team in the Security Services division. I've got both a systems and a business background, so I can share some of the experiences that we've had with AI technologies.
Great. Sean?
I'm Sean Foley. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Financial Services at Microsoft. I've been building or helping banks to look at their medium-term technology strategy over the last few years, and we've also been working a lot on new technologies and capabilities like blockchain, AI, machine learning, and so on.
Kirsty.
Hi, I'm Kirsty Roth. I run operations for HSBC globally. To give you a sort of size of scale, it's about 50,000 people in about 60 different places, and ops at HSBC is quite broad from the classic things like payments you would expect to find in ops, but also a lot of compliance operations, FCR, those things that I think will probably come up today, and particularly some of our sweet spots in the AI space.
And Luella.
Hi, I'm Luella San Juan. I'm Global Head of Client Technologies. That's the outward-facing department for operations technology. So that includes interfaces like Swift that interacts with the outside world, as well as our internal exception and workflow management. We've deployed, with very interesting results, artificial intelligence solutions in those platforms. And before I was a tech person, I was actually an English major in my former life, so I can bring some of that human nuance into the technology part.
Great. So we've got clearly lots of valuable experience in the room, but what we thought as a group that it might be beneficial before we go into the questions to share what we define as artificial intelligence. Up for debate sometimes, but just a very brief and practical explanation as context setting. So what is AI? AI enables machines to interact naturally with people, data, and the environment. The way we simplify the definition for AI is simply a tool set of technologies that can sense, comprehend, act, and learn like humans, and much more so learn these days. For sense, an example is perceiving the world, technologies that can manage images, sounds, and speech. An example of this could be audio to plain text. Comprehend technologies, these add meaning and insights, for example, classifying unusual data. Act, these are technologies that can take action in the physical world, for example, generating an email. And learn, and this is more the focus of today. We see a surge in the development of technologies leveraging machine learning, and more so going into what we call deep learning. So they can improve performance based on real-world experiences and at times autonomously. So the foundation of AI technologies, you could say, are machine learning and deep learning, natural language processing, and computer vision. And what you find and what we've listed there are essentially the types of AI technologies that we see being employed already today in middle and back offices. So that's robotics, robotic process automation, text analytics, that's typically using NLP. Ad hoc analytics are typically using machine learning and more so deep learning. Virtual agents and chatbots. And sometimes biometrics and video analytics for customer service or some corporate services. So this is, again, an overview of just some examples of how you can use some of these technologies in middle and back office today. more so we see AI being used for document contract processing, automating reconciliation, trades, accounting breaks, translations. AI can be used for both structured and unstructured data and developing insights on this. And this shows what reflects a little bit why we're having the discussion today. There's been a huge amount of development over the last 10 or so years. In fact, AI has been around for 20, if not more, years. But the availability of open source technologies and other types has meant that the surge and interest in AI is phenomenal. And I think the more basic context is that we're dealing with so much data today that we have no choice but to invest and involve AI in what we're doing every day. So on that note, just to feel a little bit the understanding in the room, we have a first question for you. We're already going to put you to work. And I don't know if you've participated in other sessions, but there is a possibility to do this using your Sybos app. And you can answer the question that's going to come up now using this app. So this is the process. You access Slido via the extended menu, click and interact with Slido, and select the room. We're in, obviously, conference room 3. Just give you a few minutes to do that. So, our first question. Are any of you using any of these AI technologies in middle or back office today? Robotics, analytics based on machine learning, or chatbots? And if you could answer either yes, all of the above, robotics only, or not yet. Okay, great. Well, that's very interesting insight. That just goes to show there's hopefully, with our practical discussion today, there will be a lot to learn. Over 60% of the room are not yet using AI technologies. So, on that note, Matt, what do you and how do you leverage AI technologies in your day-to-day?
Well, SocGen's got a number of initiatives within the AI sphere. I think when we talk about AI, most of what we mean is machine learning, but we've also done quite a lot of work with robotics or RPA, robotic process agents, recently. And I have to say we've been a bit disillusioned with that experience. I think as I talked to people internally in preparation for the session, there was quite a lot of negative comment about RPA and the fact that it was really sort of like a macro technology. And I started in systems in the late 80s, and there's, macros have their value, but I think that some of the challenges are if you need to parameterize all of your aspects of a process for an RPA, then there's a cost in doing that. If you need to add people to monitor what the RPA is doing, there's another cost there. So when you look at the total cost of ownership, there's actually quite a question mark as to whether it's worthwhile. But I think that's one specific case of AI. So just to come onto that. But I know there's a lot of interest in that at the moment. But I think it's worth highlighting because one of the challenges in this area is that we talk about AI, but it's actually a collection of different technologies.
Yes, absolutely.
And so that's one aspect. I think the other theme I'd draw out is that when you put that sort of macro or RPA in, it has the effect of sort of setting your legacy systems in aspic. It's very hard to make changes to those systems from that point because you disrupt the RPA that you've put in on the top. So it's it's something of a one-step move that it stops you really making changes to your legacy platforms from there. And I think one of the themes with AI is how do the banks in particular, how do they integrate these new innovative technologies onto the sort of, the spaghetti of middle and back office platforms that, most of the banks have. And that's a real challenge, which I think is, highlighted by some of the experiences we've had with RPA.
Yeah, definitely, and I think we'll get back to that. Sean, what is your view? What is your experience with AI?
So from Microsoft's perspective, I think we see AI as one of the most disruptive technologies that's really come to market in the last 10 years after mobile and cloud. It really is one of those technologies that will change how we run and operate our businesses. I agree with Matt on RPA maybe as the very least form of that, but certainly when you get to deep neural networks and machine learning, where you're doing pattern recognition at scale, that really has been transforming businesses. Think of everything from self-driving cars through to anti-money laundering and some of the capabilities you have around that.
Yep.
We in Microsoft have invested significantly in that area. We now have about 5,000 people who work on AI, building out those capabilities for banks and other companies. That, for us, is a first-class division on the same size as Windows or Office or Cloud. So that's the extent to which the company sees that as a huge strategic, important bet. Internally, we use it in a bunch of areas. We use it in areas like our own Treasury department, where we look at how we do forecasting of account receivables. And through implementing that, we've now had a 6% improvement quarter on quarter for the last 6 quarters. And our FX hedging has got about 25% more accurate because of that. But we're also working with lots of different customers around the world on different applications of AI. So working with people like Standard Bank on fraud detection, or other banks on credit scoring, or on chatbots and customer service. So lots of different applications, I think. Most of those, I think, are successful, provided you're very clear it's about where deep neural networks and machine learning can play a role.
Yeah, and I can identify with the transformation. Can you hear me? Yes, we similarly have been through a 20,000 person type transformation at Accenture, very much focusing on AI and robotics. So yes, shared learning experience. Kirsty, what is your view? I know you're working in a lot of different technologies all at once.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like it. So I think that maybe worth touching on RPA, being as that's come up. So I think we would say we've had mixed experience. I think fundamentally we still would prefer to see mobile first, proper good old fashioned STP to reference Matt's points on. It does sort of leave you then with your legacy tech. That said, actually, I think what we've learned as an organisation is having both those tracks is really useful, right? Because everything waiting for the sort of gold-plated solution, given our size and scale, you'll be waiting a really long time. So we've had some great successes. I mean, simple examples, like we now do all our student account opening in the UK in less than a day. It used to take many, and we used to have lines out the door this time of year. And that's all done on RPA. So nothing particularly fancy, but it's making a very real difference to our clients. And significant numbers, obviously. Everything we do is in large numbers in HSBC, but significant numbers of people we've managed to free up through doing that. And then as you move up the curve, some really good successes. I mentioned already a bit in the compliance space, but AML, transaction monitoring, name screening. I think the challenges are less with the tech, actually, and sometimes convincing the regulators and our risk people around what we're doing than it is a technology problem, so to speak. But some great successes there. We've got chatbots. We have some really interesting OCR stuff we have to do. I'm sure most people know we're huge in Asia, so Chinese characters for me are an interesting problem that we've had to solve, and how we read Chinese characters, which we've solved, quote unquote, if you can ever solve anything. Now trying to see what we can do with our Arabic. But all sorts of different things across the patch, actually, in different areas, trying them out and then working out which ones work well.
Great. Luella?
I think I have a two-part answer, right? So one is, what do we use? We use a little bit of everything. We've had success with unstructured data and running that by machine learning models. Operations, which is the division that we service, really runs into a large amount of unstructured data that may be embedded in emails or in data sets, and then having to find patterns is normally what operations does. What is the pattern for the break? What is the root cause, and so forth. So we've had a range of positive experience particularly with open source, in being able to fit models that can detect common categorizations, common exception root causes. Those particular use cases work well, and they work well within operations. And I would argue with compliance and some other big data set attracting organizations. With regards to execution, the lessons that we've learned, whether it be running bots in the background to automate run books, or machine learning, or we're experimenting with chatbots right now and running those results through some natural language processing to see if we can respond to common questions. It really does highlight that you need to have very good discipline. And we'll probably address it later on when it comes to governance, but it's made us realize that as a highly regulated large entity, we actually have to make the scope simpler and smaller. It's kind of counterintuitive, but in order to go big, you have to start small. Mm-hmm. You have to start controlled, and you have to be able to work all of the governance up front with your IT risk and your business risk and your contracting and everything. And I think the other thing that we've learned is that we have to do everything faster, right? You know, it's a kind of a trope now to say, you know, fail faster, but I think you have to try faster and fail faster so that you can make Absolutely. A decision about whether the technology is the right thing before moving on.
Yeah, and maybe back to you, Kirsty, because you have seen success with so many different technologies. How did you go about starting such a program? How did you go about starting this journey? Luella, you mentioned it requires a certain element of experimentation, starting small, getting big. How did you go about that, Kirsty?
Yeah, so I think very candidly in two directions. So one, technologies that in essence, as many of you will know, there are more vendors who want to sell you something in the space than you can count. So sometimes, frankly, what I call a solution looking for a problem. Mm-hmm. So things that we saw and then had worked in other places where we could see quite quickly how we could apply them. And then the pretty good old-fashioned purist use case approach, right? So where are our biggest problems and what opportunities did we think they presented to us? Although I was explaining to Sean in the break that sometimes means we've thought about, we've gone for problems that perhaps were even bigger than we necessarily or initially thought about. When you then think about the resiliency requirements and some of the real-time requirements of a lot of stuff that we do.
Yeah, it is about trial and error, basically, at that early stage.
But we really picked them from two directions. So areas where we thought we could get something going and we could, to Luella's point, try it out and learn something. Yeah. But also others that we knew actually somehow we got to be able to crack some of these really big problems if we're going to get to the right place.
And maybe a question for you, Sean. How important do you think data is in that story and getting data right?
Oh, data is the heart of AI, right? If you think about what it is fundamentally, mm-hmm. It's about these deep neural networks that are reasoning over large amounts of data. So in technology terms, garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have high quality data to begin with, then the reasoning and decisions that are made on that are going to be completely wrong. So some of the interesting things about that are you need to create large pools of data and put them into data lakes in order to be able to really achieve the impact you need from deep neural networks and machine learning. And the other thing that's important is you can't over-curate your data. So I know you talked about mainframes and legacy kind of being a key part of that, Matt. Mm-hmm. If you think about the fact that they have very constrained data sets, you've lost a lot of the detail in the data when it passed through mainframes. Sometimes those raw signals are the real intelligence and insight that you're looking for. So the more you can get raw data and bring it into a data lake and reason over it, the more successful you'll be.
And maybe Matt, on that note, how do you manage dealing with the challenge of data as well as embarking on this type of a journey, and at the same time continue to invest effectively in more mature technologies? Or how do you go about making the decision, this is a AI appropriate investment or this is a legacy appropriate investment, in your view?
It's a good question. We've got a lot of data scientists working within SocGen, looking at business problems and looking at the data within the organization. And I don't want to sound negative on AI. We've got a lot of proof of concepts. We've got some great examples of AI being used on things like legal documents, mm-hmm. Where we can look and parse the clauses in a legal document. A lot of them will be standard, and you're looking for the 20% or so that are non-standard clauses. So I think where we have those tools in place, they are supporting the existing production users, mm-hmm. and that's the kind of model where the data scientists work very closely with the business to pilot that and come up with proof of concept. I think that doing a proof of concept is almost the easy bit. You can do that quickly. It's how do you get it into production, and how do you sort of shift the balance? Because as Sean said at the beginning, it's a disruptive technology that it changes the way that we work with computers, well, for since they were invented, that all of a sudden they're not just doing the number crunching and the boring number crunching and spitting out a report. They're actually starting to make decisions if you let them. So I think that governance is very important. And I think where it goes wrong is when the technology leads the initiative. You're kind of looking to use the technology somewhere, then there's a bit of a warning sign there.
Yes.
So what's the business problem we're trying to solve here?
Yes.
Not how can we use
this technology, for this problem. Yes, exactly. So, Luella, maybe your view on that. Do you use also data scientists, or what approach have you taken to ascertain a legacy or traditional method versus AI?
Yeah, quite frankly, we could use them more. As Matt was saying, sometimes you have a business problem to solve for, but there are so many options out there that you can actually become enamored very quickly of the solution and deploy it before you've fully understood that you need to have not just the developers and the subject matter experts in the business, but then also people who can understand how to look at the data in a different way. The data scientists who are trained to look at signals and then help the business users to bring out the kind of signals they want to use when they're actually implementing machine learning. So we're now realizing that it's really a three-legged stool. You need the folks who are able to implement the technology. You need the subject matter experts who actually understand the domain, so they understand what they want to get out of that exercise.
Yep.
And then you need people who are trained in the analytics and data science that is required to really massage the domain, whether it be a huge data lake or sometimes in process real time. But regardless, you need all three really to be successful. And I think everything is so new that it's going in fits and starts in terms of assembling those teams in the right proportion.
Yeah, absolutely. There's very much a governance and change and a people dimension to AI.
The people
very
are
strong
the hardest part,
dimension.
actually.
Yeah, right. And Kirsty, your view again. Are you? How did you go about, or maybe for the audience, if 63% are not yet really looking at AI, how did you go about making the decision to invest in AI for a certain area versus another, or what areas rather did you find were the most obvious ones to start with?
Yes, so I think echoing some of the other comments, I think it's sort of been somewhat easy in a funny way to get going, right? And use sample data and stuff, and then you hit all the real problems. So actually, I think our sort of early track record on proof of concepts or pilots or whatever you want to call them hides a little bit the underlying issues, right? So then you get into what data are we comfortable using on a public cloud? Can we even agree as an organization what we think the data rules are by country? And believe me, that's a pretty good debate between regulatory, legal, the technicians. So a whole bunch of different challenges as you sort of gone out of quite quickly an effective POC into what does live really mean and how is it going to be sustainable. And then in terms of how we picked, I said I think we started with what we thought were some relatively easy use cases, if we can call them that. But we have also started with some quite big ones just because we think the opportunity is massive. So a classic example of that would be repairing payments. So we make 380 payments a second. So we are a huge user of payments infrastructure, globally, and of course sometimes those things go wrong and they break, and we have thousands of people literally whose job it is to fix them. Right? Not the most interesting job in the world either, by the way. So so we've gone after things like that where just the use case seems so compelling, and given the types of technologies we've seen, you sort of have to believe that we can do that in a better way. So yeah, much more from that choice. But I would encourage people probably to start with the ones that are quite well proven. I mean, there's a few we've all mentioned that I think we've probably all done. The contract one is a classic example that works very well. And I think a lot of the banks have gone after it. And just to get a bit of a sense of how this works and get, we've really had to have the whole life cycle from legal people, procurement people, tech people, regulatory people, all involved all the way through to figure out how we sort of even onboard these things in the organization and get them going, and then how we govern them.
Yeah.
So I think you don't want to pick anything too hard too early, to some extent, as the your organisation is learning what that really means, and how you're going to kind of move forward. So like balance, like all these things.
And I think you prompt a very, very good question, which is indeed, how do you govern such a program? How do you actually, you decide on the sort of the problem area, and indeed in all of the interactions I've had with clients, it's typically the areas that we showed in the beginning, but it's very different. It's very specific to each individual client. But still, at the end of the day, all parties have to come together to embark on a journey. So maybe going back to you, Matt, how would you set up a governance for an AI program? How much involvement would you have of business versus IT together? How would you do that?
Well, I think as Luella said, you need the three main constituencies involved, and you need to have a very clear idea of what the business challenges you're trying to solve. And I think you have to start with that problem and do the analysis and look at the tools and make sure that you have clear decision gates as you go. Mm-hmm. We use a lot of agile development, so it tends to be a fairly fast process to move forward and stop and review. Making sure that you've got the business firmly involved. I think where it can go off the rails is if you don't have a clear requirement, you don't have clear ownership, and you don't have a sort of clear business owner. And this goes right back to my, starting 25 years ago. That was the kind of systems methodology that everyone was doing. This, but actually, the germ of that is still true today. That I think I've been aware of some people spending a lot of time and money chasing down one solution without really being clear of what they're trying to fix. I think it's as much what you have to avoid doing than making sure you've got the three key parties involved in the governance.
I think it's a very interesting remark, because I think when, for example, the likes of RPA, robotics process automation, started out about 5 years or so, a lot of the solutions that are on the market are very sort of intuitive, and as a result, I think a lot of these sort of pilots or some of these experimenting started in the business area, where the costs were coming. But very quickly, and also over the years, I think also us with our clients, we've seen very much it has to be a joint affair. It is a company-wide engagement. I don't know, Luella, I can see you nodding a lot. You share the view.
Yeah. Yes. When you engage in something that's disruptive, one of the things that you have to kind of take a step back and ask is not just what business problem you're trying to solve for, but is there only one way to achieve the outcome? I think you're all aware of having to claim benefits for your technology projects and so forth, and the old saying, but we're only able to save fingers and toes, right? Not entire head counts or entire risks mitigated, but only bits and pieces. So I think we're coming around to the realization that it really has to be in close partnership between the business and technology, and most of the time the solutions are a layered approach, and there isn't one single silver bullet. Not just RPA and not just machine learning, but for an entire business process, it's probably a combination, and the governance actually has to honor the renovation projects that are still in play, and then try to balance in whether it's better to fix it at the root or apply some of these things so you can bank the savings and then automate it away over time. It's easier to say that in hindsight. That's why I was nodding a lot, because our organization often sees new things, and we try it out initially and think that that's going to bring in that big savings. But I think we've learned, like any other technology, like the macros of the past, that if you deploy something too quickly without being thoughtful about the context, the bigger context that the firm is operating in, then you're going to rapidly not really get the big savings or the big targets or renovations that you're going for.
Absolutely, and I think it also brings to another question: how can you leverage AI strategically? Mm-hmm. How can you, and Sean, I'm looking at you for this one, but there's a lot of focus on AI bringing down cost reduction, increasing quality, throughput, etc. But how can you use it to expand your service offering? How can you use it more, upstream?
So one of the things that we think about AI is that while it's described as artificial intelligence, the real opportunity is sometimes in augmented intelligence. So really think about the people and processes you have in place today, and how might you use artificial intelligence and capabilities around them to make them more effective. So one of the examples we've seen is a lot more on the front-end customer servicing side, not in terms of just chatbots doing customer service activities, because that's pretty well known and well run. But think about financial advisors, and today the fact that one person may serve 50 customers, but if you could put the right machinery around that person supporting them, answering emails responsively to customers without being asked based on basic questions, being able to schedule meetings, even looking into data like LinkedIn data, seeing when somebody got a new promotion for a job, and then reaching out to have a financial conversation on the back of that life change.
Right.
That's the sort of thing that would be transformational for the business, and now that person could serve maybe 200 customers instead of 50. You're now far more effective, and you're using AI in a much more strategic way.
Right.
Those kind of opportunities can really be transformational.
Great. And Matt, I'm not sure you'll be using LinkedIn to leverage AI strategically, but what is your view? How can you do that?
Well, I'd agree with Sean. I was nodding away there because I think the whole customer experience is one area where there's a great deal of opportunity. And we've got an example in our markets business where natural language process will look for requests for quotes and automatically jump in and give the quote to save the trader having to do it.
Yep.
It'll highlight the client request over an internal request to prioritize the client. So I think those kind of aspects are good examples where we'll see a lot more in terms of customer experience. I think Sean mentioned chatbots, which are fairly common now, but I think there's a lot of firms working on linking large data stores to a chatbot with AI that will go against the massive reference work to pick out the particular passage that is of interest to you in your query.
Yep.
So so in sort of 12, 18 months, there's a lot more value coming from chatbots coming to people.
Combination of technologies.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area, and I think also the banks will. If you look at the fintech world, I think that's where the fintechs and the banks will start to collaborate more. Because the fintechs have got an opportunity to really focus on one thing, which is the customer experience. And if you look at the PSD2 regulation coming in, that'll reinforce that opportunity.
Yep.
So I think that's a real area for the banks to collaborate and where clients will get great benefits from AI solutions.
Definitely. And Kirsty, do you see also an opportunity to use it strategically
so I think
as well?
two sides. So one is obviously genuine revenue, right? So you can, without getting into too much, you can imagine the sort of thing we do with the payments information that we have, and we can see trade flows and what the opportunities are in the market, and we're doing a lot of that. You've also, though, frankly, I remind people all the time that actually just improving the servicing experience typically means your clients want to upsell and cross-sell with you, right? So,
Absolutely.
one of the frustrations in today's very bureaucratic world, if you as I do every couple of days, try and talk to clients, and they moan about, the amount of FATCA and CRS and W9 forms we as banks love to send them. If you can make those processes better, people are going to do more business with you. So for us, it's both sides. There are genuine revenue opportunities in this space, but there are also, real customer service improvements that will actually drive the same thing in effect.
Luella, anything to add?
Yeah, I think obviously, people highlighted the opportunity to increase excellence across the board, right? Excellence. I think, in addition to that, increasing safety and security. Aside from risk and reg, there's also the fact that we need to protect our firm data and our client data ever more so. And so, to be able to use artificial intelligence to detect issues before they happen, to create situational awareness so that if there is an ongoing issue with a particular client or transactional flow, you can anticipate ahead of time and put controls in place. And then last but not least, cybersecurity and fraud.
Yeah.
So I think it's the whole gamut of being able to run a business, but it previously would have taken us longer to formulate the use cases or the rules because there's just so much data to analyze.
Yes.
And that's where artificial intelligence is,
Make it go faster.
like Sean said, augmented intelligence for us.
Great, and that prompts me actually to ask the audience another question about your use, or the non-63%, your use of AI. So maybe can we get the next voting question? So if you are using AI technologies today, where are you using them? Are you using them for KYC compliance or client interactions? For core trade, transaction processing? For exception management? All of the above? or none of the above? If you can take your app again and answer, that would be great. Okay, I guess as expected. So reflecting a little bit our discussion on the maturity of the likes of chatbots and RPA, I think a lot of the areas which banks try to focus on is indeed compliance and then client onboarding, which is a typically paper-heavy and process-heavy activity. So that's interesting insights. Maybe let's move on, because I think we haven't really touched on it yet that much, but AI is all about the machine, but also the human behind the machine, or working with the machine. So what do you need to do, or what do you need to consider when you are embarking on a AI transformation or AI-driven transformation around your culture, your corporate culture, your workforce? How does that need to change? Maybe, Matt, would you like to share your experiences?
Yeah, I think
does it need to change?
Well, it's quite early days yet, and I think we talked about some of the examples and the benefits. I'm an optimist. I think that there's a lot of sort of doom stories in the press with people talking about the impact on jobs. I think that the model where we have augmented decision making or augmented AI is the way we'll see it. Mm-hmm. So I tend to think of the analogy when I graduated, we didn't have things like the internet or web designers. So when I talk to my kids about their careers today, what do I know what will happen in 20 years time? So I tend to think that we've been through this a few cycles before, and I think it is very challenging for the organization because it changes the way that we do things. And so I think I'm an optimist, and I think it will give people better tools to make decisions rather than having to do the work themselves and grind through to produce reports. It should allow, for example, a scenario where a compliance officer is presented with a case from an AI tool to say, here's a potential issue because of these factors here, and here that needs review. And I think one of the key things we haven't talked about yet is the transparency of that decision making by the AI. That it's very important that we're able to see the transparency of how the tool has arrived at that decision, and that has implications across lots of aspects of the business, from auditors to banks to load approvals. So I think that's a really key principle that that needs to be there as we look at how it changes the way that we work with tools. And
also, indeed, changing the mindset of your workforce and thinking about those aspects, those legalities. It's a large learning initiative, essentially. And maybe Sean, you referred to transforming 5,000 odd workforce. How did you go about doing that? How did you?
Well, we were fortunate in that we started out our AI journey probably earlier than most. We started out about 8 years ago, initially when we were building up our Bing team to compete with Google in search, and then trying to differentiate ourselves on not just providing answers, but trying to inference what were you looking for and why. Mm-hmm. And so while that's generally been quite successful for us, what it actually created was a huge AI capability within the company that we were then able to apply to lots of complex business problems. And that's where I think for us the transformation has been both the acquisition of talent, because we've not only hired a lot of data scientists, we've also been acquiring lots of different companies in AI to try and bring those capabilities in. It is really an arms race right now from a tech company perspective in terms of where the AI capability will exist over the next 3 years. The second thing is the investments in cloud have been really important in terms of building out the core machine energy or engine that that AI needs to run. So if you think about AI problems and you want to solve them, you really need the biggest brain. And to have the biggest brain, you need the biggest number of nodes. And you can only do that today in cloud scale. And so some of the investments we've been thinking about, like FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays, allow you to run cloud and neural networks way faster. So an example is we We did an experiment to translate Wikipedia from English to Spanish in 3 seconds. And that's something you can only do when you have large scale. So culturally, people have to, and Matt talked about this earlier, rethink business problems, not in the frame they have today, but in terms of, if I had these new capabilities, how would I completely transform my business? How would I rethink it? And that's a lot of the work. And then governance is also really important in that, because you're going to hit lots of funky areas where you're going to cause problems. So you talked about the machines making decisions. I had the fortune to present to some regulators recently who are looking at credit scoring, and what does that mean when your AI decides I'm not going to give you a loan? Is that because you're a minority? Is that because your loan record isn't good? If you don't have explainability in the AI decision-making behind that, then it becomes very difficult both to regulate and to justify. And I think that's an area where increasingly we're going to see a lot more focus from both the regulatory community and from the tech community to be able to explain what AI is doing.
It's a very good point, and similarly, I think we see a huge surge in what we call responsible AI or explainable AI, which is exactly that. It's, if you're deploying it at scale, you're going to get into those sophisticated business processes whereby you absolutely need to provide that transparency. So, Kirsty, what is your view on?
So I think for us,
the workforce.
So far it's been a story of education. So firstly, obviously for my people, because they do read the press and many of them do think that, the robots are coming and there won't be any jobs. And I think actually it's better now, having done some real examples where we can actually explain these people stopped doing this quite basic task and now they're doing something more interesting. And to the optimistic comments here, that actually people are moving up the value curve, and so actually it's better for their careers. And I think that's getting more comfortable, but you still spend a lot of time trying to make people feel okay about where this is going. And then I think it's educating not just the broader organisation, by which I mean, it was interesting, Matt mentioned audit, but we've had to sort of think all the way through, what are we doing, why are we doing it, do people understand what it means, have they thought through the risks, and right out to the regulators. There are some wonderful regulators who are extremely pro these kind of techniques, and there are some that are frankly quite fearful, right? And that's in a role like mine, it's an unbelievable spectrum as to where they are, which also sometimes influences where you will test things. We tend to test in certain geographies more than others, because then they'll kind of help each other get comfortable. But it is just a story of educate the whole time as you kind of work through this. Yeah,
absolutely. And Luella, do you share that same experience?
I do. I think if you think about it, technology is really there to take out the noise. It's really there to kind of simplify and streamline what we're doing. It doesn't absolve us from investing in our own humanity. Good thought and good judgment is a collaborative process, and AI is quite far from that, and that's what makes us unique. So if we're going to be automating things with processes that can run 24/7 and munge much more data than we could, then the owners of that technology, which are the humans, need to be able to put a lot of good thought into what you're implementing it for, and then have the controls in place to be able to understand where to apply it and where to not, and then have checkpoints where the decision making can still fall to the business owners to take in the entirety of their experience, context, the regulation, the country. That's going to be hard to replace, and if you just trust the technology only, then we're really missing the opportunity.
And because of this, the continuous need for investment, as you said, in context, the investment in transforming the workforce, and some of the other complexities that you mentioned earlier. I mean, what is your view of the actual benefits? What's the business case? I mean, have you seen this journey as a positive one, and with what kind of a lead time? I think in the end of the day, for the 60-odd% in the room who haven't embarked on this journey, we talked about it being necessary to experiment, to start small, and it being very specific to an individual's organization. At the same time, there needs to be a clear benefits case. What is your experience with that, without sharing any numbers?
So, interestingly, the smallest category that showed up there in terms of using artificial intelligence for exception management has been one of our biggest lifts, because many times, historically, we've thrown people at the problem. Once you've identified the exception, then you take a bunch of people and you try to leverage all kinds of different strategies to figure out what caused that exception. We now know that machines can do that effectively, with the right rules in place. And what that does is that it actually frees up what you originally hired the people to do, which was to be, the human interface to the clients or to be the human judgment call for more complex business processes, more competitive, thoughtful business processes. So I'm an optimist in that regard. I can see that we could do more by automating mindless tasks and freeing up what you had originally hired the people to do,
Right.
and apply good judgment and quality.
And then Matt, what is your view in that you mentioned in the beginning that you saw some challenges, especially with RPA, for example, through your journeys. Have you seen a beneficial outcome so far as well?
For RPA or generally?
Generally AI, but you mentioned...
Generally, undoubtedly. I mean, it is, as Sean said at the intro, it's a game changer. And, the follow-on to RPA is we're now looking at RPA with a combined AI component. So that you have the AI component managing the state of whatever the process is. So, we haven't stopped that. We're just change the tool and looking at a tool with AI on it. So, as Luella was saying, we see benefits, particularly in the exception management process, because a lot of our business is just complicated. It's not fundamentally complex.
Yep.
If you're calculating the NAV, there's just a lot of steps to go through, a lot of different paths you could happen, but it's fundamentally not not a complex process. So we definitely see the benefits there. I think we talked about some of the other aspects and some of the other examples that we've got. I think if you look at chess as an analogy, if you look back 20 years ago when the grandmasters were beaten by sort of brute force, and you look at a competition of free chess now, which is completely open rules, and the most successful team is a combination of computers and humans. That beats the machines alone. So I think that sort of optimism I have comes from that kind of example where as Einstein said, computers are incredibly fast, accurate, and stupid. Humans are incredibly inaccurate, slow, and brilliant. Together, they're an unbeatable combination. So I think that for me is a really good analogy for the business world and how we see some of these tools being used in that cooperative way, where we take away a lot of the boring stuff, and it becomes more of a decision making supported by the AI.
Great. I think on that very positive note, on embarking on an AI journey, I'd like to maybe open the floor to questions. I can't actually see anybody because it's very bright lights here. There we go. Would anybody like to ask our panelists some questions about AI? How would they go about or anything at all? Any questions?
One there.
Great. Is the mic coming your way now?
Yeah, I mean, the principle of AI, I guess, is or machine learning is to allow the machine to have some autonomy, to use an algorithm, to use feedback, to learn and make better decisions. I mean, is the panel wary about losing control over the tool? I mean, do you have the off switch close to hand?
I'll speak from a Microsoft perspective. I think we do actually think that at some point in the future, quite a bit down the line, that will be an issue. And so we've started working with a bunch of the other tech companies on what should those governance rules look like, and how do you build in those off switches at a time now where you have complete control over how this works, versus later on when it's a lot more complex and a lot more difficult to really understand the implications of changes you make and how easy it'll be to get the output you want. So I think governance is really important, and that's a key part of it.
Can I answer that as well? I think it's a great point. And if you look at things like the flash crash in 2010, it was because the programmers had the foresight to put a circuit breaker in that it stopped, because the algorithm is just doing what it does. It doesn't have any sense that the price is dropping through the floor. So I think that's a good example where, as you say, you need to have that foresight. We've seen chatbots spouting offensive and racist language because that's what they hear in their training. We've seen recommendations for, if you bought this, you might like these elements to help you make a bomb. So I think there's a lot of these cases that will start to come out. When we need to be smart about how we think ahead about this, because, as I said, it just does what it does without any moderation. So I think it's a really key point that we need to be thinking ahead about how we govern the AI tools.
Right. It would be good if we can actually create an integrated blend of technology disciplines with ethics, for example. So in law, they teach the ethics of law as well as law. And I think we're at a time now where we should consider blending ethics and technology together, because those exact questions are coming up now as we see the ramifications of the kind of data that AI can consume and how it reflects back to us.
Yeah, and the regulators are demanding that lineage, right, of that decision making and how it's been done. And certainly most of the examples we've done, we'd categorize more as machine learning, which is really with rules, so you can argue it. But as you get more and more into the deep learning space, that's going to be a challenge to really understand exactly what decision has been made and sort of prove it that you're effectively compliant.
And we've seen the UK regulator, the FCA, come out with a discussion paper on kind of machine rules. So they're already thinking in that way. How can the regulators produce rules which can be easily coded into the machine coding? So I think that's a good sign.
There's always going to be the human factor. It goes back to it somehow, somewhere, even if it's a trigger switch. Do we have another question in the room? Yeah. Sorry, there's one down the back.
I think one of the biggest challenge, as I see, is availability of skill sets, particularly when you're competing with the same number of people handling regulatory agenda, handling the core platform changes, versus moving to AI space. So can you comment on how you are trying to address this and balance this across the various initiatives? Thank you.
Want me to start? So I mean, we've mentioned data scientists a bit, right? And that is one of the most fun. I'm always laugh when my team come back and say, we need 300 more. And I'm like, sure, good luck with finding them. So, it's a challenge. And I think many of the tools, frankly, where most of the stuff, I'm sure as many of you know, is actually available on open source these days. But you need to have a certain skill set to use it. So many of the tools, I think, Diane, as you mentioned, are becoming more and more popular, where it sort of helps you in a more intuitive way think through the problems versus sort of having to have that level of knowledge so that you can take, what we would traditionally have called analysts, right, and give them that additional enhanced kind of thinking. So you have to sort of think about how you're going to make that work and how you scale some of these things up. What are you going to do? And it in our world, it leads us to things I guess we never thought we'd have to deal with, like they will work in the centre of London, they will not work in Canary Wharf, right? So you've got to think about where you put your sites and how you locate people that you want to work in these kind of spaces. I think we've had less of a challenge with, focus on the projects, but just sheer numbers of some of the skill sets are a challenge.
I saw another question, yeah.
I got a question. From my experience in robot processing is we have used quite a bit of data where humans have done some of those work, and we have changed into certain algorithms to mimic that. Let's call it sentiment analysis, for an example. And what I've figured out that human beings actually have done certain things in an incorrect way. And when we actually tried to mimic that, it, to your point, did it much faster and has down the line impact on some other processes. So my question is that how do we actually operationalize it when you have incorrect way of categorizing certain data by human beings and machines just have, replicated it? I mean, how do you actually, close that loop and make it better?
I could give an example. So we talk quite a lot about payments. It's a big focus for us, but we quite often use multiple data sources. So one of the things that we do to stop that, fat finger keying, sort of copying down the line, or the machine learning and believing that the one it's copying was a correct response and it wasn't, is we have multiple data sources, and actually often more data sources than we would have had in the sort of good old-fashioned 4i or 6i world, where these things are sort of done in pieces. So that's one of the ways that we've looked at that, is to have it in chunks. Any other remarks? Sean, do you want to add on to that?
as you were talking about data earlier?
Yeah, I think the dirty secret of AI and machine learning is that 80% of the time is actually spent getting the data right. 20% of the time is spent getting the models right.
Yeah.
So actually you need, as we talked about, to get much more data sources, more capability in there. Also use AI and machine learning to reason across the data that you're getting as input so you can flag exceptions and at least have more thought into whether you're using the right data sources. And as I said, try not to lose the raw signals in there while you're creating it, because that's always a risk that you end up getting the answer you want as opposed to the answer the data is actually telling you.
And I think also when you embark on these type of engagement, there's a whole sort of cleanup in terms of processes and analysing issues and why do we have recurrent exceptions processing for a specific area. So there's the investment that's needed up front to actually not only look at the data but also the processing. How are you doing things today is really critical in when you start testing with some of these technologies.
I would add to that, and as a complement, you need to build in a feedback loop if you can that is real time, so that it's not just a matter of deploying your solution, getting it right, getting the inputs and the outputs right, but then if you can actually continue to have a feedback loop so that the model learns when it's wrong and then can be corrected, which again goes back to the business trying to be vigilant and making sure that all the right answers are being provided in, then you may not always get 100% accuracy for certain cases, but you can always ensure at least ongoing quality in the answer if you're constantly feeding the machine with new use cases that it can learn from.
But I think it's a great point, and we tend to assume that humans are right. And I was having an argument with someone the other week about self-driving cars, and they're saying, well, when are they going to be perfect? Because even if they're 99%, then there's going to be 1% accident. I said, well, do you realise 3,000 people die every year on the UK's roads? That's about 10 people a day. So humans are not that great, actually. So you only have to beat the human error rate to to make it worthwhile overall. So I think it's a really interesting general point about the use of AI when you compare it to human activities.
Yeah, absolutely. I see another question here in the middle. Yep.
So one of the things that really differentiates banks is the data that you have and the ability to act upon the data and then so forth. So with artificial intelligence, as you start to commoditize information and everyone starts to have the same information, the speed of information to make decisions, how does that start to differentiate some of the banks? So, you use information for deals, you use information for quotes, you use information for customer service. As everyone starts to have the same information from an artificial intelligence standpoint, being able to use machine learning to optimize that, how does that start to differentiate what you offer as your secret sauce, so to speak?
Who wants to take that? Who wants to reveal their secret sauce?
I guess a couple of comments. I think it'll be a long way off before everybody has access to everything, and probably I suspect we'll all be retired, so we might be quite safe. But one of the key things is what we found actually is the amount of fintechs who do want to partner with us because of the data that we have, that you can actually, it gets you to a really nice place quite quickly. And people want to learn, actually, and they want to come and work with the banks and understand what we've got. I think it would be very hard to replicate some of that. But it comes back to good service. Same reason we want to use a lot of this is to make our, the products we offer better, the service we offer to our customers better. We've talked quite a bit about that human combination. That's not going to go away. So I think it will be, just because you've got all the data isn't going to make you a great person to come and get advice from. You're going to want that combination of the human piece plus what we can actually get from the data, and that we can know people better and give them smarter offers and those kind of things. So I think we'll see it morph over time. I don't know if we'll ever get to a position where there's nothing left, but that's just my personal view.
So we will not be eliminated. There's always, again, the human factor keeps on coming back. We had one other question there in the middle at the left.
How about some very difficult processes? How about internal audit or IT audit, QA work? Have you applied AI to any of those processes internally?
So I'll speak from Microsoft's perspective, not as a bank, but actually as a technology provider and cloud services. We've started using AI extensively in terms of how we manage and operate our cloud, because when you have a cloud that's hyperscale with, data centers between 4 and 16 football fields of servers, and there's 40 of them around the world, you can't do anything manually, so it all has to be done in an automated way. So all of our internal auditing goes into data lakes, and we then reason over that with AI and machine learning to try and find patterns. For example, we use that for cybersecurity, looking for unusual activity across the network in the cloud, so that we can see things before they become aware of, before our people become aware of them, and have them flagged to them as things they should review and look into. So I think the reality is more that audit will be augmented with AI, just like all other activities will, and those auditors will spend more time on looking at new ways of bypassing the system, as opposed to things that today they spend a lot of grunt work doing.
Okay, I can see we are out of time, so I think we've got one last question. Go on then, I'll be in trouble.
You raised an interesting point on the cyber security where AI can be applied. Do you think AI would call for additional layers of cyber security to be implemented, or AI can be implemented to become kind of a cyber police? That means to develop kind of a cyber defense system.
Yeah, I think cyber defense is one of the key investment areas for AI right now, both in terms of pattern recognition, which is a kind of a classic AI problem, but also looking at how can we look even across business transactions or other things. So if I look at some of the work that's being done with the regulators on centralized trading and consolidated audit trails, they're looking at how do they get better visibility for unusual trading patterns across that. So I think we're just going to see it as an extra layer of defense across all different kinds of applications, not just the technology, but also the business layers as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everybody for listening, but before you get up, I just wanted to ask one last voting question after you've heard the panel sharing their practical experience. Can we have our last voting question? Is there a future for AI in your middle or back office? Yes, no, or hopefully I need to experiment? Would you like to go to your app and...
Haven't scared them off.
Excellent results. What can I say? Great. Well, I hope that the 63% of you out there have been convinced, and I'm sure that panelists, I'm not going to offer their time offline, but if you manage to grab them, I'm sure they're open, including myself, to answer additional questions. Thank you for your attention. And thank you to our panelists. Okay. Thank you very much.